Well, welcome. Thanks all of you for coming out on what I guess turned out to be a rainy night. I didn't expect that. But my name's Tom Crouch. I am the Senior Curator of Aeronautics here at the National Air and Space Museum. And it is my pleasure and privilege to welcome you on behalf of our director, General John R. Daly, and the rest of the museum staff who put this place together. So welcome to your National Air and Space Museum. There are a few guests I want to introduce before we really get started. I'll save the introduction of the four speakers until we pull them up here one at a time. So let me introduce first Michael Patras. Michael is the head of the Mount Lowe Society, a central feature of the Lowe family, Thaddeus Lowe's descendants, a collector of Lowe material who's building a Lowe Association museum in Pasadena. And so he was here, he's been here all week, and helped to make our Civil War Balloon Weekend last Saturday really special. And Peter Jacob, who is our Associate Director for Research and Collections, who helped to make all of this possible. Kurt Westergaard, are you here? Kurt Westergaard, who runs digital imaging in Falls Church, Virginia, and who also played a really important role in making last weekend's Civil War Balloon Weekend a big deal. I want to thank him too. And last, but most certainly not least, I want to introduce the man of the hour, Professor Thaddeus Sobieski Constantine Lowe, better known as Kevin Nat. Kevin is a world-class balloonist who, fascinated by this story, has prepared himself to play a major role in representing Civil War ballooning and Thaddeus Lowe and the Balloon Corps in the months and years to come as we walk through the 150th anniversary of the late unpleasantness, the Civil War. Well, we're here tonight to hear four talks, really, about aspects of Civil War ballooning. And I'm going to kick it off. This is the only way I know how to do this. If you had been on this spot 150 years ago, obviously this building wouldn't have been here. What would have been here was the Columbia Armory. It was a federal-style building where the District of Columbia stored its weapons, edged weapons, powder, its military supplies, basically. And right next door to us, off to the east, was the Washington Gas Works. And that's why Thaddeus Lowe, on June 18, 1861, made one of the most important balloon flights of his career, and the reason we're here tonight, right in front of our building, right out here. He went up to about 500 feet, and the upshot of that flight, he sent the first telegraph message that had ever been sent from the air. And the upshot of that flight, I'll do it in a little more detail here in a second, was the creation of a balloon corps for the Union Army, the first military aeronautical unit in American history, and the birth of aerial reconnaissance in the United States. So it was not an insignificant moment. And I think it's really kind of neat that that moment happened here, right in front of where this shrine to aerospace achievement stands today. So we thought that this was an occasion we couldn't let pass. We wanted to talk about some of this history, and that's why we're here tonight. Thaddeus Lowe didn't invent reconnaissance ballooning, or the balloon for that matter. The blue balloon that you see on the screen is the first Montgolfier hot air balloon to carry human beings aloft on November 21st, 1783. And the red and white striped balloon is the first gas balloon, hydrogen balloon, to carry human beings aloft just a couple of weeks later on December 1st, 1783. When the first balloons flew, it sent just an enormous wave of excitement across Europe. It's difficult for us to understand, I think, today, living in an age of supersonic flight and space probes going to other planets and leaving the solar system, how exciting it was when human beings first left the Earth. But it was incredibly exciting. Half the citizens of Paris, one of the largest cities of the world, half of them turned out for the first flight of that red and white striped balloon on December 1st. And one of the residents of Paris was Benjamin Franklin. Franklin, the Adams family, the Jay family were among the Americans who were living and working in Paris, negotiating the Treaty of Paris, which was going to bring an end to the American Revolution. And Franklin was special to the French. They didn't think of Benjamin Franklin as a politician or a diplomat so much as they did a great scientific thinker. He had literally inspired both the Montgolfier brothers and Jacques Charles, who built that first hydrogen balloon. So when Franklin was in Paris, he was really looked at as one of the world's great scientific thinkers. And he was fascinated by the balloons, absolutely fascinated. And when he looked at the balloon, some people looked and said to themselves, what good is this thing? In fact, at the flight of one balloon, Franklin actually overheard someone in the crowd say, well, okay, but what good is this going to do anybody? And Franklin immediately popped up and said, sir, what good is a newborn babe? Franklin saw immediately that there were going to be applications for the balloon. And the application he saw was military. He said immediately, he talked about reconnaissance ballooning, and he talked about balloons being able to move troops and that kind of thing. The French were listening, and in 1794, these two guys, the fellow with the eye patch on is Nicolas Conté, who was a scientist, and the fellow on the other side with the high collar is Jean-Marie Coutel. In 1794, the Committee of Public Safety put Conté in charge of developing balloons and inflation equipment and that kind of thing. And they put Coutel in charge of the military side of the operation. And they created an aerostatic corps. For the first time in human history, balloons were being used to do battlefield reconnaissance. The first time at the Battle of Fleurus, as you can see, in 1794. The balloons remained in use with the armies of the French Revolution for about 5 years. And it was in 1798, 1799 that the Directory, the government of France at that point, the Committee of Public Safety was long gone, decided to do away with the Balloon Corps. A lot of their equipment had been lost when ships were sunk at the Battle of Aboukir Bay in Egypt, and the French Balloon Corps went out of business. There were other experiments with balloons over the next few years in Europe, especially in the 1830s. But it's really not until the American Civil War comes along that the balloons get their first real trial by fire. Thaddeus Lowe was not the first balloonist to come forward and say he wanted to play a part in the war and demonstrate what balloons could do. These three patriotic fellows were actually there before him. The gentleman on my left with the handlebar mustache is James Allen, as you can see. He was the scion of a famous family of balloonists who continued to operate through the 19th century. He made his first flight on June 9, 1861. Allen had come to Washington with the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, which was one of the first regiments to rush to Washington when it became clear that the war was coming and there was a need to protect the capital. Allen came with his balloon. He was going to operate as a balloonist with the 1st Rhode Island. And this is an image from Harper's Weekly. And it shows you roughly what Allen could have seen from his balloon that day. As I said in the slide, he flew about a mile north of the capital. Allen wasn't a particularly good political guy, and he had connected himself to a local regiment rather than trying to find some central government office that he could serve as a balloonist. And so, as an independent balloonist, he disappears early on. He winds up, as we'll see later on in some of the other speakers, as one of Thaddeus Lowe's leading balloonists. The second fellow whom we saw in that slide was John LaMountain. He was a New Yorker, upstate New York, and kind of a bumptious, brash guy. He had made a really famous flight in the years just before the war, flying from St. Louis all the way into the wilds of Canada toward the East Coast, and had built quite a reputation for himself. And he was a difficult guy to get along with, but he had come, like Allen, on his own, determined to demonstrate what the balloons could do. After making a few flights up here near Washington, he transferred down to Fort Monroe, which is at the very tip of the peninsula between the York and James River, and we're going to hear more about that in a few minutes. And he began making operational reconnaissance flights down there. I said the first operational reconnaissance flight on this slide. That's really arguable. Thaddeus Lowe probably makes operational flights before LaMountain. But LaMountain is down there operating, and as we'll hear later, even operating from the water, from a ship in the river sometimes. But ultimately, like James Allen, he runs afoul of politics and is forced out of being a government balloonist. He and Lowe, in fact, were fairly bitter rivals. And this is Thaddeus Sobieski Constantine Lowe. Lowe was a New Hampshireman and had a thick New England accent, I've always imagined. As you can see, he was a handsome devil. He had been fascinated by science and technology as a young man. He wasn't all that well educated, but he educated himself. And he began, after some time as a shoemaker and doing some other things, he began offering lectures on science and giving demonstrations, sort of a mid-19th century Mr. Wizard kind of thing, and was quite successful at it. In the late 1850s, 1857, he'd been fascinated by balloons for some time. He acquired a balloon, taught himself to use it, basically, and began operating as an itinerant aeronaut, inflating his balloon, making flights, selling tickets so people could come and watch him, listen to lectures on ballooning, that kind of thing. And this is an image of his very first public balloon flight on July 17th, 1858. Lowe was a really ambitious guy, and very quickly he decides that he wants to fly the Atlantic. He builds a huge balloon, the city of New York. This is a much exaggerated artist's conception of it, but it was a huge balloon, one of the largest of the time. The balloon valve that you see in the smaller picture is in the collection of the National Air and Space Museum today, on exhibit at the Haase Center. Originally, the balloon was called the City of New York because he was going to start from New York. When he had a tough time raising money in New York to finance the trip, he ultimately transferred down to Philadelphia, and he changed the name of the balloon to the Great Western. And by this time, as this image shows, he had become quite a figure in the National Illustrated newspapers and other kinds of publications. And people were making fun of this notion of trying to fly the Atlantic. The balloon bursts, ultimately, and Lowe is stuck. He hasn't given up the notion of the Atlantic, but what he does is write a letter to Joseph Henry here in Washington, who was the secretary of the Smithsonian, asking for advice. What do I do now? My balloon burst. I still want to fly the Atlantic, but obviously I need to make an impression on people before I do that. And Henry's advice was, well, other people have made long flights from the middle of the country toward the seacoast, and they've gotten publicity that way, found people who would support their dreams of flying the Atlantic and that kind of thing. So in April 1861, And those of you who know your Civil War history know what else is going on at about this time. Low inflates his balloon in Cincinnati. This is a daguerreotype of his balloon being inflated. The balloon was called Enterprise. There was already a tradition of naming flying machines Enterprise. The very first military balloon, the balloon that Coutel flew at Fleurus in 1794, was named L'Entreprenant. And if you translate that from the French, it's Enterprise. And that's what Low's new balloon was named. He flew, as you can see, 620 miles from Cincinnati to the oddly named Unionville, South Carolina. And when Low came down in Unionville on April 20th, 1861, I guarantee there wasn't much Union sentiment down there. Fort Sumter had been fired on, and it was just a hotbed of Southern fire eaters who immediately pounced on this guy with, again, what I imagine is a thick New England accent, and arrested him. Somebody recognizes his face from the illustrated newspapers, so they let him go for a while, and then they arrest him again. He's arrested twice. But finally, he gets away and makes his way back north. And again, he's writing to Joseph Henry again and expressing the desire to do something to support the Union in this conflict that's coming. And Henry suggests that he come to Washington and they'll see what kind of a demonstration they can put together. Among Low's Cincinnati friends were newspaper editors, Murat Halstead, who gave him letters of introduction to people in Washington too. So Low comes with the Enterprise and his wife Leontine to Washington. They register at the National Hotel on June 5th. He comes right down to see Joseph Henry, and they make the rounds. They see Salmon Chase, who's the Secretary of the Treasury. They see Simon Cameron, who's the Secretary of War, talking up the notion of the balloons. Henry is really convinced that the balloons can be of value to the government, and he has faith in Low. And so he really becomes Low's big booster. And on June 11th, they finally go to see the fellow on the screen, Abraham Lincoln. People forget when they think about Lincoln today that Lincoln was fascinated by technology. To this day, Abraham Lincoln is the only American president to hold a valid U.S. patent. It was this for lifting boats off sandbars in the western rivers. And he was just enormously proud of that patent. In later years, his son Robert remembered that when Lincoln was in Congress in the 1840s and the family came to visit him from Springfield, that's the first thing Lincoln wanted to do with his son Robert, take him down to the patent office and show him this model of what Lincoln had patented. Between Lincoln and Simon Cameron, the Secretary of War, the Smithsonian gets $250, or what actually happens is they tell the Smithsonian to go ahead and fund a demonstration, and they'll be reimbursed for it. And when everything was said and done, it was $150. The building that you see with the big flag on my right, or my left rather, is the Columbia Armory, which was here in 1861. And if you look in this image, down toward the bottom, let me point to it for you here. That is the smokestack of the Washington Gas Works, which was, as I said, just to the east of us. So Henry sends Low down to this end of what was then called the Smithsonian grounds. He's got a workshop at the Armory, and he can put his balloon over the gas main and fill it up with city gas and fly that way. And so it was on June 18th, 1861, right there. Thaddeus Low inflated his balloon and took up a telegrapher, and in fact the president of the telegraph company wanted to go up as well. And he not only went to 500 feet, but he sent a telegram, the first ever sent from the air, to President Lincoln in the White House. They had laid a line from the base of the balloon down the mall to where the telegraph line came across the Potomac from Alexandria to the War Department, and they tied into that. And they actually strung a temporary line from the War Department to the White House so that the telegram actually came directly to the president. And at the end of that, they hauled the balloon down, and a group of men and boys literally walked it, tethered. This balloon was tethered to the ground, as all of Lowe's were, and they walked it down the mall, around the corner, to the White House. Mary Henry, Secretary Henry's daughter, was on hand and fascinated by it. I'm going to read you a section from her diary here for June 18th, 1861. Professor Lowe made some experiments with his balloon today. He wishes to be of service to the government in reconnoitering the forces and position of the enemy. He rose to a height of 500 feet, carrying with him light telegraph wires, by means of which he found he could readily communicate to individuals on terra firma. About sundown, he moved majestically along through the air to the president's grounds, the balloon being drawn by a crowd of men and boys. We started to the same place by a shorter route, but were soon overtaken by the professor and the crowd. He seemed to be enjoying the ride greatly. And he did. And Lincoln did too. Lowe tells us that Lincoln actually invited him into the White House. They kept the balloon apparently tethered close to the ground on what's now the south lawn of the White House, because the newspapers report that over the next several days, Lowe continued to make flights, not from down here on the Smithsonian grounds, but from up there on the White House grounds. Here's the telegraph and the telegram. So Lincoln is excited, and he clearly anoints Lowe as the fellow he wants to create a balloon corps. But there's a problem. There's one more of those aeronauts who hasn't been disposed of yet. And in fact, he's the greatest of them all, John Wise, the most famous of all the American pre-war aeronauts. Wise, while Lowe is dealing with Lincoln in the War Department, is actually anointed by the Bureau of Topographical Engineers and the Army as the guy who's going to do observation ballooning. And in fact, as you get into July, as Lowe is trying to get in to see the War Department and get things organized, Wise is actually ordered to go down toward where the Confederate armies are gathering along Bull Run Creek in Prince William County, about 30 miles south of here, with his balloon and do some observations. On the 20th, he's actually ordered to come on down to the Washington Gas Works, where Lowe is reinflating his balloon, and to inflate his balloon instead. And Lowe's ordered off the gas main. Wise goes on the gas main. Early the next morning, actually about midnight, an officer and a group of soldiers show up. They tie Wise's balloon down in a wagon, and they take off for the Bull Run battlefield. They can actually hear the battle going on. They don't quite make it to the battlefield. They're inexperienced in handling balloons. The balloon becomes kind of tangled and torn in branches and is so badly damaged that it can't be flown. So Wise has to come back to Washington with the rest of the Federal Army, which of course has lost the battle, with his tail between his legs. Some days later, a Union officer came up to Wise and had the audacity to say, "Mr. Wise, the balloon part didn't go so well, did it?" And Wise, I'm sure with a twinkle in his eye, could return, "Well, the balloon part was about as good as the battle part." At this point, Lincoln is really exasperated. The battle's been fought, it's been lost, there was no balloon there. He actually calls Lowe back down to the White House and says, "Why weren't you there? We could have used a balloon on the battle that day, on the 21st. And Lowe has to explain that he's been trying to get into Winfield Scott, the commanding general's office, and he keeps getting rebuffed. Lincoln makes out this note for him, which is in our collection today. "Will Lieutenant General Scott please see Professor Lowe and, do something about the balloon?" The next day, Lowe goes on the 26th of July, you can see this is dated the 25th, back to the War Department, and he tries 4 times during the day to get in to see Scott. and he's rebuffed every time. He goes back to the White House, and Lincoln actually walks over to the War Department with him, walks into Scott's office, introduces Low, and says, General Scott, we're going to have an aerostatic corps, and this is the man who's going to lead it. Now, I want you to help him out. I want you to introduce him to Admiral Dahlgren down at the Navy Yard, and I want to get this thing organized. And so that's the point at which I'm going to leave it. And I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Dr. James Green. Jim, as I said, is professionally a scientist, the head of planetary sciences at NASA headquarters, but avocationally, he's one of us, an historian of the balloon, and I think ultimately will be the author of the definitive book on Civil War balloons. So, Jim Green.
All right. Tonight I'd like to talk about the establishment and the operations of the Union Aeronautic Corps. And Tom has really set the stage quite well. Here we have Thaddeus Low now with some legitimacy because Scott now is convinced that maybe we could use Low based on the insistence of Abraham Lincoln. And after his spectacular flight on the Mall, for which he sent that telegram, and you shouldn't underestimate what was happening at that time. That telegram, verbatim, was in every major newspaper in the United States, from East Coast to West Coast. So Low was indeed becoming very famous. And on the other side of the Potomac, in Virginia, Irwin McDowell, who was the commanding general of the Army in the Virginia area, wanted Low to come over and make some observations in the Arlington and Falls Church area. So he invited Low. Low went down to the gas works, and of course, as Tom pointed out, the gas works are here on the Mall. And then he came across the Long Bridge. Now, the Long Bridge is seen in the lower left-hand corner, kind of a flat bridge just above the Potomac. It's an easily crossed bridge, although there are telegraph lines and telegraph poles to watch out for. He's able to get men from the 8th New York assigned to him on detail to be able to take the balloon across the river. So he goes to Arlington, and from Arlington he makes some observations and begins to tell the general and others what he sees. Now, who are the others? Well, they are reporters. Low has an entourage of reporters that are unbelievable, and they will write fabulous articles. They'll be in newspapers in Philadelphia and New York, all over the place, and then many of them, in many cases, get reprinted in the South. The South wants to know what's going on in the North. Now, Low makes also fabulous observations in Falls Church. And here he is in the lower right-hand corner. Harper's Ferry is showing the Enterprise at the camp of McDowell. And so from these balloons, Low is able to take up a number of officers. And these officers actually sketch the roads. Now, the Union Army, of course, doesn't know much about Virginia. They don't have Google Maps. And so they need maps of this area. And from balloons, and in this example from the Enterprise, they were able to make some fabulous maps. And this really helps spur on the interest of the Army for observations by balloon. Now, here's another one of the maps that are made from balloon. This one also from the Enterprise, I believe. And you see the fort. The fort's right here as sketched. Confederate pickets and then Union pickets in the back. and the balloons up in the right-hand corner seeing everything. So these are beautiful sketches that are made. They're needed by the Army, and the Balloon Corps becomes associated early on with the topographical engineers. So they are indeed looked upon as being the group that works with the Balloon Corps. Another time when he goes back to Washington, D.C. and inflates his balloon is he's required to go over the Chain Bridge and make observations in the upper part of the Potomac. And in this case, the Chain Bridge is a little bit different. It's a covered bridge, not completely covered, but it has walkways on either side of it. And so when the men bring the towing the balloon up to the bridge, they're able to walk the walkway on either side with the 2 to 3 tethers from the balloon. And low in the balloon at well over 100 to 200 feet has a magnificent view, not only of Virginia, but looking down the canal. Here is the canal, and then here's the Potomac. So the canal and the Potomac, and he crosses the Chain Bridge and makes observations in Virginia. Now, once again, these reporters follow Low everywhere. They have wonderful articles that appear in newspapers, and this turns out to be another major benefit of the early observations of balloons in the Washington, D.C. area, and that is it helps calm the fears of the local public. You know, Washington, D.C. could have been an island with a Confederacy all around. Maryland almost seceded from the Union and almost became a Confederate state. And so the concept that the Confederacy was just across the Potomac and all they needed to do was amass a large army and come across and invade Maryland and take over Washington, D.C. was constantly on everyone's mind and constantly in the press. The important thing about the balloons are that at 1,000 feet, where these tethered balloons would go up and they would observe approximately 15 to 20 miles. Well, that's about the distance an army will travel in a day. So reports from the balloon of here I see smoke rising, or I see large formations of men, and they're coming down the roads, and we know what roads because we've sketched those from the balloons. Many of those reports would appear in the newspaper, and knowing that all clear is coming from the balloon was extremely important for the local public. Here's another example of some of the sketches that were done. These were even done by servicemen. This one from the 20th Michigan. This happens to be in his pension record. This is Harrison Jeffrey's sketch of the balloon camp. And the balloon camp is right here off of Fort Corcoran. This is where Low would obtain a detail of men and then make observations and then report those back to the commanding general at the time. And these earthworks, or these forts, were basically earthworks with trees chopped down everywhere, and this enabled then the Army to feel safe, keep Washington, D.C. safe from these forts, and the balloons to make observations in the far field. So it was a good combination, and because of that, Low then becomes the head of the Aeronautic Department. And so he ends up with writing his ticket. He could do no wrong. He could ask for anything and get it. Now, one of the things he did ask for but never got was he would like to have been associated with the Army. He realized in his first foray down south with the Enterprise and being caught in South Carolina that if he was ever caught, shot down, or ended up in the Confederacy, he would be hung as a spy. And so he really felt having a commission in the Army would help him with that. He never was given a commission, so he was always a contractor, and all his aeronauts were contractors, and everyone that he would hire would be contractors. So, but Low was given a contract by the U.S. government to build a series of balloons. And this is one of the first balloons that he built in September 1861. It's called the Union. And it is a huge balloon. As you can see, it's 38 feet wide, 45 feet tall. It held 32,000 cubic feet capacity. Now that's actually far more than the Enterprise, which held about 20,000 cubic feet of gas. It could lift 4 cables and 5 men, and it cost the government $1,500. And he would paint them with beautiful, beautiful names and beautiful icons of eagles and many other things. Another balloon in that same class, 32,000 cubic feet of gas, is the Intrepid. This is an extremely famous balloon. A lot of the Brady photographs that were taken of the balloon core has the Intrepid very prominently displayed. And on one side, you see the name Intrepid, but on the other side, once again, a U.S. Eagle, bearing flags, and a portrait of General McClellan. And of course, McClellan is the patron general at that time that really enjoyed having these observations from the balloons and reports. Another balloon called the Constitution. And this is a slightly smaller balloon, about 25,000 cubic feet, and so it would hold about 3 men. And this cost a little less, about $1,200, painted with the Liberty statue. Beautiful balloons. United States, another one that had eagles, and also in that same class, 25,000 feet. This is also another one of these famous balloons. It's called the Washington. It has a beautiful portrait of Washington on one side and the name on the other. It's 20,000 cubic feet. It's on that same class as the Enterprise. Now, Low, when he built these balloons, they were made of silk. They were double ply, and the seams were folded over and sewn. He had up to 50 seamstress sewing these balloons, each and every one of them. And he would do those in succession, and he made these in Philadelphia. He also coated them with a varnish that kept these very airtight. Air is actually not the right word, because these were not hot air balloons. They were hydrogen balloons, it turns out, or gas balloons, which is carbonated hydrogen. And so consequently, he painted these in so many bright colors that he was really showing off what he had. He was really quite the showman. The two smaller balloons that he made, the Excelsior, about 15,000 cubic feet gas capacity, cost about $1,000. A one-man balloon, something he could inflate quickly and get up into the air and make some observations very quickly. And finally, another one, the Eagle, was that same class, 15,000 cubic feet, one-man balloon. And these baskets were always painted beautifully, and they were painted with stars and stripes. He was really quite a very patriotic individual. He also learned early on, when he was shot at during one of his flights by Union soldiers, that he wanted to make sure even the Union knew he was Union. And so in many cases, he would fly flags off the sides of his balloons. Now today, when one thinks about Air Force and doing stealth observations from the air, why isn't Low's balloons more bluish or gray or sort of blend in with the clouds? That wasn't his philosophy at all. His philosophy was, you can see me, therefore I can see you. And there was major intimidation that he made really quite obvious. And in many cases, you can read a lot of the Confederate reports that they would make movements or they would hide themselves. They would double back on roads, and they would do everything they could to really be their movements obscured such that the people in the balloon would not be able to observe them. Now, Low also, with the balloons, although he could fill those in Washington, D.C. gas works, he realized he needed a capability to go with the Army. And so when the Army trekked out into Virginia or in other locations, he really needed to be able to generate gas, hydrogen gas, in the field. And so he invented these gas generators. And if you had an opportunity to come last weekend to the mall to see the mock-ups of the gas generators, these are just beautiful generators that he developed. They're on the normal standard axles of a wagon, a government wagon, and these were developed at the Navy Yard. And let me give you a little idea how this worked. This is a sketch of the balloon, a gas generator. The insides had shelves. The shelves were used to put iron filings. And then in the top, Also what was added were funnels, and in the funnels they dropped down a solution, a dilute solution of sulfuric acid. So you had H2SO4 and iron, you had a chemical reaction that liberated gases and hydrogen in particular that flowed out of the containers. In fact, these had to be held very tightly because the pressure was quite high in the containers. Gas would normally flow out and end up, this would be very hot. You could hardly touch this, and so you had to initially cool the gas, and that was done in the first box. It was water was used to cool the gas, and then it went into a purifier, a lime solution for which then the hydrogen would bubble up, and then it would then inflate the balloon. Now these balloon gas generators, Lowe built 12 of them. He used 2 per large balloon, and then he used 1 each for the 2 smaller balloons, the Excelsior and the Eagle. And here they are displayed on the mall, as Tom had shown in his last slides. And the Navy Yard built these, as I mentioned, and they cost about $470 each. And then the inflation would range from $60 to $100 each and every time. Now, when he did inflate the balloons, and here's a wonderful Brady photograph of Lowe and the gas generators, 2 gas generators inflating one of his balloons. In fact, Lowe is standing right here, watching the inflation go on. The netting is holding the balloon down with sandbags, and the men are right next to a stream. There's a stream of water that runs down in this region. It's nicely tucked away in a little valley on the Gaines Mill farm in this particular case. And he would inflate these balloons, and the Intrepid, which is the largest class of balloon, would take about 3 hours to inflate. And that inflation would last him several weeks, nearly a month. He would be able to go up and make observations, top it off once a month, and keep going. So this was really quite an operation. Now, he also needed men to work the balloons. Because he wasn't officially part of the Army, he always needed a detail of men. Typically, a detail would be about 30 men, and he would use 3 lines to hold the balloon, sometimes 4. He used to use 1 line, but some of the observations in a windy period where the balloon would spin would be terrible, and so he recognized for stability he really needed more than 1 line, and so he developed early on a system of 3 lines for his balloons and 10 men each on each line. Now, as you can see, here are the men with each of the lines. There's one group, there's another, and a third group. They also then could move the balloon and put it in position where it needed to be, and then they would tie off the lines with on the stumps or other trees. And then, of course, at night, they could guard the balloon. But in many cases, the balloons were used at night. Another trick that Lowe would do, he would go up at night, and he would then observe and count the campfires. And assuming a certain number of Confederates around each campfire, he could get an estimate of how many men were there and the distribution. And so this also was quite important information. So by the time close to the end of the first year of the Civil War, from November 1861 to March 1862, he had started to employ these balloons. He employed it at Edwards Ferry, Clouds Mill, Pohick Church, and Bud's Ferry. So as you can see, there's a nice line of balloons that are all up and down in Maryland and even in Virginia, that where the Union Army was occupying. And those regions then would provide important reports, and reporters would report what was seen in the balloons in the newspapers. And once again, it would provide that barrier and allow that understanding from the general public that things were okay or they weren't okay, depending on what was happening. Now, indeed, Lowe needed aeronauts, and he was very picky. And he had his favorites. John Wise was certainly not one of them. And he hired Ebenezer Seaver, also John Steiner, Freneau. Those were aeronauts that were used at Edwards Ferry. Even John LaMountain at one time, even though Low and LaMountain were seemed to be always on the outs, was up at Clouds Mill and associated with the Balloon Corps. But Low really didn't like LaMountain, and there was such tension there that he really didn't care what LaMountain did, just to stay out of his way. Thaddeus was also went to Pohick Church and did his own observations a lot in that area, and then he had Pullen and Seaver, and he hired his father, Clovis Low, to help in the administration and really help work the balloons. And so he had really quite a group of aeronauts, sometimes as many as 7 or 8 aeronauts working with him. Now, this turned out to be a really tough business, and it's a tough business because these aeronauts were the most fired on of any individual in the Army. There turned out to be a region called the danger zone, which was close to the ground. So as you raised your balloons, the gunfire, and these would be either rifled shelled or other cannon fire. And in fact, some cannon balls literally went between the basket and the balloon itself through the riggings. And as you got up to about 300 feet, then you were in the safe area, and you could actually make your observations from there. So in some cases, they would raise the balloon at one location and bring it close to the area they wanted to observe. In other times, they could raise it quite quickly, and so they didn't have as much danger in that area. But indeed, they were constantly fired on. And in fact, it's almost humorous that when the artillery really tried to take out these balloons, you had to realize the Confederates were up to something. They did not want the balloons to be up so that their movements would be seen. And sometimes they actually were successful in scaring away the aeronauts, and the balloons would come down and stay down, and they could perform whatever function they wanted to do. But indeed, in the 3 years of the war, no artillery shell burst any of these balloons. So they made well over 3,000 flights between this sets of balloons, it's believed. Now, just very quickly, Low was in a variety of campaigns. This is the Peninsula Campaign. It's a complicated campaign, but he brought everything to bear, and it's really one of the highlights of his career and what the balloons could do with McClellan. This will be discussed a little later on. Another one of the campaigns that he was involved in was the battle at Fredericksburg. And here's a beautiful period sketch. It's out of the Library of Congress. And you can actually see the balloon being hidden by trees, small trees. They would cut down these and create a fence row here. A stream would flow through. They needed the water. This is always a dead giveaway on where the balloon stations would be because they had to use the water in significant amounts, along with the gas generators. And this is at the Phillips House. And so from that view, they observed the Battle of Fredericksburg. This was a horrendous battle. The Confederates won. Many Union were killed trying to take this hill called Marie's Heights. So the Union Army is heading up to the hill, and at the bottom of the hill, the Confederacy really mowed them down. Now the balloon at Fredericksburg was actually not manned by Low, although Low was there at the time. It was really manned by a staff officer who had written about what he saw, but never bothered to tell General Burnside what was going on, or didn't appear to be ever asked about what was going on. So it was a real waste of opportunity for balloon information in an area that was definitely needed. Now the reporters, as I mentioned, really followed Low quite extensively, and he really catered to them. He catered to them so much that it's believed that he would feed their horses and would feed them, and he would obtain funding for his aeronaut corps, and it was believed he was using that funding to feed the horses and the reporters, to keep them there, to allow them to write fabulous reports. And that constantly was a source of aggravation with the aeronauts, who really needed the money. They were employed. They were contractors, after all. And so this was some of the problems that Low was running into as he was trying to administer the balloons. Now I want to read a section out of a report that was in the Philadelphia Inquirer. Now, I have personally looked at probably 2,000 reports that have been in newspapers during this period, and they're just absolutely fabulous in many ways. In fact, they can be very detailed. There's probably more detail in some of these reports than many of the Army generals would have liked to have seen. And at one time, McClellan banned the reporters to run around with Low for a short period of time. But this particular reporter is getting back to Philadelphia. The banner is "The latest from Washington, special dispatches to the Inquirer, Washington, D.C., November 14th, 1861. Title of the article is "The Great Balloon Reconnaissance." And he's in the balloon Washington at Budd's Ferry. The tackles were hastily fastened to the stumps of trees. The lines passed through. And almost instantaneously, the earth appeared to sink into a delicious haze. Silvery ribbons of smoke from the enemy campfires seemed to have been scattered about in elegant profusion for miles away in every direction. The foliage of the trees in the surrounding forests gleamed and then faded in dim vision, like the visions in a vast kaleidoscope, or the views from some of the immortal colorings of a Titian. The broad Potomac in its winding way, with an occasional white speck in the distance, floating with listless sails. The flotilla off Indian Head, troops on parade, a number of miles distant, yet appearing almost within hailing distance, all aided in making up a scene such as few enjoy in a lifetime. Now, these are the kind of things that ended up in the newspapers that the public just loved. They wanted to know that kind of experience that was going on in the balloons. And of course, Low really catered to that. That enabled him to constantly be in the public eye, which he did indeed love. And it also aided him in working with generals, because there was a lot of positive sentiment. However, when you read diaries of some of the soldiers, many indeed felt that the balloons were the real humbug. Now, since the growing charges of Low's mismanagement of a contractor group in terms of how he was distributing pay and what he was doing relative to his employees, he fell under an IG investigation. And that investigation, towards its end, really didn't have enough evidence to do anything. But Hooker, who was the head general at the time, decided they really needed to clean house in the Balloon Corps. And this was the guy to do it. It was Comstock. He was a chief engineer of the Army of Potomac. He was really a superb engineer. And he had gone up in the balloons many times, used them, and so was really quite familiar with the balloons. And so when he became the administrative head of the Balloon Corps, this was the first time we had an active civil servant, the head of a Balloon Corps. He really made radical changes. He felt the nepotism of having Clovis Low associated with Thaddeus was wrong. He fired Clovis. He fired a number of the other men that he felt were hangers-on. He reduced Low's pay from $10 to $6. Now, Low is getting $10 a day. That's sort of a colonel's pay. And so that's a fair amount of money, whether you flew or not. But Low was really working hard and really trying to make a go of the Balloon Corps. He also told Low he had to stop all his administrative duties, that Comstock was now there to do that, and he wanted Low into the balloons and be a full-time aeronaut. And so he wanted to have regular reports. Well, this really insulted Thaddeus. I mean, almost to the point where Thaddeus decided, well, I'm going to refuse that pay cut. I'm going to work for free, and at the end of the next campaign, I'm going to quit. So I believe Thaddeus really felt that he could earn this trust back with Comstock by doing it this way, and over a several-week period, end up back in his good graces. Well, that didn't happen. The Battle of Chancellorsville was the next major campaign that occurred, and it was in May 1863. And Low had 3 balloons up, and he actually only had the 3 aeronauts left. He had James Allen, his brother Ezra Allen, and Thaddeus Low. And so at one time, the 3 balloons were up, and as you can see, the blue areas are the Union Army, the red areas are the Confederate armies. This is the famous flank attack by General Jackson and folded up the Union flank in this area. The balloons were stationed on the other side of the Rapidan, observing Fredericksburg, which Early's men were stationed. And the balloons did observe Early's men leaving this position and reported that quite quickly. And then the Union Army came across. But eventually they were pushed off completely off this area and on the other side of the Rapidan. Hooker was badly beaten. And at the end of that campaign, Lowe quit. So he didn't gain that confidence back. And then there was only Ezra Allen and there was only James Allen. And so these two men now managed the Balloon Corps. And after another month of observations, and in sometimes very severe conditions, and in fact, the only balloon accident occurred, it was during this time period when Ezra Allen was up in the Washington, and a huge wind came and split the balloon. And the 4th Maine, which was managing it at the time, grabbed the lines and moved it upwind, which allowed the basket, instead of going straight down, to come down gently. And Ezra survived that accident. But at the end of this battle, and Hooker was recalled back to Washington, the quartermaster department had to pick up all the balloon gas generators, all the materials and supplies, and move them back to Washington, D.C. The balloons were used once again. Actually, Ezra and James would use one of the balloons and make observations of the retreating army. They were in that last position, and watch the Confederates. And so they were providing information about the safe return of the army back to Washington, D.C. Well, the quartermaster department didn't take the balloon material back to the D.C. Armory. They took it to a warehouse. And of course, they took it to warehouse number 5. And as we all imagine, since we don't have any pictures of warehouse number 5, what it looked like, and of course it has to look like this. Indiana Jones showed that. And so you can imagine the balloon material, all the balloons, all the gas generators wheeled down the hall and stored in the warehouse. And they were stored for more than a year, until finally a clerk, seeing that the balloons were there, thought for sure they must be rotting. And this particular clerk then alerted his supervisors. It was decided, if they're rotting, we must get rid of everything, all the balloon supplies, so we can recoup some of our money. And indeed, that's what they did. So within 2 weeks after this clerk decided they probably needed the space, which is why they did it, they put out ads in the newspaper saying that there would be on auction all the balloons. In fact, we will sell at public auction at Government Warehouse number 5, and there it is in the red box. It's actually the site of Rollins Park. All the balloon equipment that the government had. So that was 7 balloons, fixtures, the remaining silk that they had that they used for ground cloth that they would lay the balloons out before they'd fill them, and all sorts of things, and iron filings in addition to the sulfuric acid. Now, Lowe came down from Philadelphia. He was living in Philadelphia at the time, and he purchased the Washington. Now, later on, after he leaves and goes to private life, he would also use the Washington for public rides. He would also use another balloon called the United States, which might be a war balloon, but I don't think it was. But he did buy the Washington, and the balloons went to the 4 winds. We don't know what happened to them. There's no material left over from the balloons, and that ended the Balloon Corps early on in the war. So with that, let me now introduce the next speaker. Tom will. Yeah. All right.
Our next speaker, Mike Bomey, is the director of the Virginia Aviation Museum down at Byrd Airport in Richmond. Jim lives on the peninsula between the York and the James, and he's going to tell us about specifically balloon activities during the Peninsula Campaign of 1862.
Thank you, Tom. Let's see if we can get this technology going. Ooh. Let's get it back a little bit. There we go, slide 1. All right, got a question for you. How many are from the North? Raise your hands, be proud. You're here to talk about the Civil War, right? How many of you from the South? It wasn't called the Civil War. What was it called? There you go. Just want you to understand, audience, who you're sitting next to, who's around you. All right, again, thank you, Tom, for the invitation. I can speak for everybody else. As interesting it is, hopefully for you all up there, all of us down here are learning something every time we hear everybody else speak on this subject, because I've bitten by the bug, and I know everyone else here has been bitten by the bug. I'm detailed to talk about the Peninsula Campaign, and then after that, I'm going to talk to you about the Confederate Balloon Corps. They did have a balloon. They had a couple of balloons, and we'll talk a little bit about them. Peninsula Campaign was a program or a advance on the Southern capital that was hatched by the guy in the bottom right. Who is he? General McClellan, relatively younger general. He was well-liked, perfect organizer, and was a great general. He had one little problem that we'll talk about as we get into the battle, but he was a great organizer. Guy on the top, who's that? Yeah, it's Lincoln. He was a great president for the time, and he was the one who really kept this country together, and I thank him for that. But McClellan came up with the idea. It was blessed by the President of the United States. The idea was to let's take 140, 150,000 Union troops down to the peninsula, go up to Richmond, and let's cut the head off the snake and end this war right now. That was the first plan. Lincoln was a little bit timid about allowing that many people to go, so he cut it back to about 105, 110,000 and kept about 40,000 closer to home. He still wasn't convinced that the capital was safe. So McClellan is now given the go-ahead with his operation. Let's see if we can get this thing to go. There we go. You've seen this slide already, but in essence what happens is they go down to Hampton, Virginia, and after they have all their people and equipment ready to go, they start moving up the peninsula. They stop for a while at the Yorktown blocking action for about a month. Then they go up to Williamsburg for a couple of days, and then they finally end up on the east side of Richmond. So the whole march takes about a month and a couple of days to get there. Now, on March 12th, that's when Lowe receives orders to bring down to Fort Monroe one of his small balloons and a balloonist, Ebenezer Seaver. He's there to provide intelligence to the naval forces that are going down, because what happened just a few days earlier? The Monitor and Merrimack, actually it's the CSS Virginia, but the great battle happened on the 9th between the Monitor and the Merrimack. We're talking about an evolutionary change in naval history happened just a few days earlier. And they had this plan to bring down all these ships with all these men. We're talking hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of men and horses and mules and cannonballs and everything are coming down. So Seavers was deployed down there to troop the line, see what was going on Hampton Roads Harbor, and make sure that the CSS Virginia was not going to be a problem for the deployment. The actual deployment starts on March 17th. Here's a little history lesson. When we started the Civil War, how many ships did the Union have? Anybody guess? No, about 45. We had a blockade of the South. We're talking close to 3,000 total miles, 10 major ports, 180 other inlets and everything. And the North only had 3 capital ships that were capable of going down and actually providing blockade of southern ports. What's interesting is the United States started off as a third-rate naval power. By the end of the Civil War, we were #1 in the world. We had close to 600 capital ships, 70-some ironclads, I forget the total number. It was an awesome display of ingenuity and the ability to build stuff. Anyway, one of the things they did, when you're at war, you all of a sudden own anything you want. So all of a sudden they had hundreds of steamships, hundreds of barges that they owned, took ownership of, and they put together this flotilla and headed down to a place called Fort Monroe, or Fortress Monroe. This is what it looked like back then. And you can see on the left side, on the right-hand side, that's where the famous Monitor and Merrimack battles all occurred. So you can kind of see why it was important to do the intelligence down there. Now, I'm from Hampton, Virginia originally, and I didn't realize all this was going on back then. But down there around Hampton, Old Hampton, he had 105,000 troops all mustering up. And on April 4th, they're ready to go, handed out bus tickets to everybody, jump on a bus, and they start going up I-64. Now, while this is really going on, who knows who Pinkerton is? Remember the name Pinkerton? Shout out, who was he? Yeah, detective. He was known for hunting down criminals and all that kind of stuff. Well, Lincoln hires him to provide intelligence support to his armies in the field. And so he had been deploying spies out there. Now, spies in those days were civilians. And unlike today, what would happen to a spy back then? You would beat the heck out of them, get whatever information, tie them to a tree and shoot them and move on down the road. Today, the ACL would probably make you a hero. You'd read your Miranda rights and you'd probably run for Congress. Who knows? But times were different back then. That's my point to you. But they had been going out ahead of the Army looking to see what's going on. And most of the people that they were able to get information on were from displaced white civilians as the armies were moving up, and they were haplessly caught behind enemy lines, unfortunately, in the freed slaves. If you look at the educational level of everybody back then, how many do you think were college graduates out there that they talked to? High school graduates? You know, most of them had zero education at all. Armies were brand new, so their knowledge about what was going on was very, very tainted. So when they were moving up the peninsula and came to what's become known as the Warwick-Yorktown line, the reconnaissance reports that Pinkerton was putting out is, you've got probably as close to 100,000 troops that you're facing. Well, that's a big problem. And again, McClellan's, one of his downfalls was he was a very cautious man, so he decides to stop and survey what's going on. Now, these are some actual maps that were used during the Civil War. They're really cool because you can actually see where they drew the balloons on there. How many have been down to the Coast Guard station, the training base down in Yorktown, are familiar with that? This is where this is all going on. Who remembers what happens there at Yorktown 75 years ago? You know, their great-grandfathers fought the original Revolutionary War. So we have two layers of very, very important history about ready to occur right here. Now, this is a picture that was drawn after the fact by Lowe's first flight over Yorktown. If you look carefully, you can see where the York River Bridge should be today. It's on the left-hand side. General Fitz-John Porter was invited to go up with Lowe when he's surveying the enemy fortifications there. Because when he went up, he says, I don't see 100,000 troops there. I don't believe this. So he brought Fitz-John Porter with him so he could ascertain for himself what we're really seeing. Now, Magruder, who was a commanding general there, was putting on a really good rouge by moving troops around, moving horses around all the time, trying to make his strength much larger than it really was. But Lowe really didn't believe there was that many people. The problem was that McClellan was a cautious man, and even though others were telling him different stories, he chose to err on the side of caution, and he basically stops and stays there for 3.5, 4 weeks while he's setting up his siege guns and all that kind of stuff. Now, this is a picture of, it's a hand-drawn picture, obviously, of Lowe's camp there when he was in Yorktown, Virginia. And a couple of days later, he's detailed over to Warwick Courthouse. It still exists today, and he sets up a second balloon station, kind of like when he was protecting the Capitol. And goes up and he overlooks the battlefield there. Again, they're making maps, surveying the intelligence that they can bring back. Here's another great picture of the battlefield. In the near ground, you can see the general's headquarters. On the other side of the road, you can see McClellan's balloon station. Up on the top left, you're going to see the fortified town of Yorktown. And again, if it was there today, you could see the actual bridge there. So again, we're fighting the second major war in the United States history on top of each other. One of the interesting things that occurs, we were talking earlier about the reporters and how they were important to Lowe. Guess what he finally does? He takes a reporter up with him. First time in human history, a reporter goes up in combat and actually reports on what's going on while he's flying in the balloon. This is a view from the other side of the York River. It's a Union artillery camp lobbing shells across the York River, and you can see the balloon in the top left center. Now, this says May 17th, 1864, Harper's Weekly. Unlike today when we can pull out our iPhones and get instant information or go home and watch TV, radio, or whatever, back then it took about 2 weeks for an event to occur in one part of the United States and people actually to hear or read about it elsewhere. So although this is reported on the 17th of May, this actually happens on or about the 5th of May. And this is a picture that details that they go up and all of a sudden they realize that the rebels have vacated the defensive lines, and now McClellan's urging everybody forward to follow the Yankees as they're going up the peninsula. This is the picture that details that. Now, from here, and again, I'm not going to get into a lot of the details about the actual Peninsula Campaign, but Low and his balloon force go up the York River, hang a left up the Pamunkey River to a place called the White House on the Pamunkey. The main army goes up the peninsula, while another naval task force goes up the James River headed towards Richmond, kind of a three-prong attack on the capital. Now, if you ever Google White House, and you're looking for a specific one, it's going to be days to find the one you're looking for. When I was looking for a picture of the White House, it took me about a week and a half because there's more than 2,000 different White Houses out there, and that was 6 years ago. I have no clue what there is today. But this is an actual picture of the White House on the Pamunkey. One of the things that all of us who are historians, we're really storytellers, hopefully with facts. But we want you to walk away with a couple of things. One of the things I would like you to always walk away when you hear history, when you hear stories about history, it's always intertwined. It always integrates itself and moves away. What's interesting about the White House, A, it was owned by General Robert E. Lee's son. Second thing is, Martha Washington and her husband, George Washington, honeymooned there. Interesting how life always connects itself. When they arrive, this is just a sleepy little hollow off a very quiet river, and I'll show you another picture of it here in a second. Coffee is still hot on the table, breakfast is ready to go. What would have changed the Civil War if they would have been able to capture Robert E. Lee's son and his family? Who knows? Now, when they get there, interestingly enough, they realize right away that they're deep behind enemy lines and they're by themselves. General Stoneman's army is about a day late and hopefully not a dollar short. So when they get there, they have a dilemma because there are rebel troops. Not a lot, but there are rebel troops around there. Now, if you remember, did you show them, I forget, did we show them a picture of the G.W. Parke Custis yet? I'm going to tell you, it looks very much like the Monitor. Same shape, stuff that hangs off the deck, looks kind of similar. And realize they didn't have TV, didn't read 6 o'clock news and watch what was going down at Hampton Roads Harbor. They just had general descriptions. So Low realized that he was in deep behind enemy lines by himself. He knows how reconnaissance works. So what he did was he realized he had a savior out there in the, quote, Monitor. And what he did was set up every tent he could, got as many fires going as he could, so he doubled or tripled the size of his force there, at least from an intelligence standpoint. Fortunately, next day, Stoneman shows up and he is safe. Now, here is a picture of, again, another picture of his balloon camp there at the White House. Again, this was a sleepy little river where a railroad crossed across and 1 or 2 little rowboats. That was all there. Within 2 days, they had this huge, hundreds of boats, ships, and barges there full of everything an army of 100,000 would need, because this is where McClellan's supply depot is being built. So this happens overnight. Now, by the 20th of May, they have everything. They're ready to go. And this picture, which I found a couple years ago, really is cool, because on the left-hand side, you can see the floating depot. In the center and the back, you can see the White House. And then in the foreground on the right side, you can actually see Low's gas generators being carted off as he is part of General Stoneman's entourage that's headed towards downtown Richmond, which is only 16 miles away. By car, 15 minutes. All right, they travel till mid-afternoon, and they're just short of the Chickahominy River, which is that one in the foreground, and they stop, and they set up the balloon, and up they go, and this is the view that they probably saw. This was actually done well into the battles that we're going to talk about here shortly. But in the foreground, you can see the Chickahominy River, and in the center back, you can see the town of Richmond, and behind it, you can see the James River that winds by it all the way down to your left to the Hampton Roads Harbor. Now, what's interesting to note is I live in the bottom, well, let me see. How does this thing work? There we go. Yeah, I live about right there. For 2 years, I had no clue this stuff existed. Had no clue this stuff existed in history. So for the last 10 years, I have a passion that runs very, very deep to learn about this stuff. But that year was one of those 100-year rainfalls that you hear about. Everything was muddy all the time. The river was swollen much larger and much deeper than it is today. In fact, when you drive across it today, it looks like a creek, literally. There's very little water there, trees everywhere. It's more like a swamp. But when they get there, it's a roaring river, and it becomes a huge problem for McClellan. And again, I'm not going to get into the details of the battle. Now, just like they protected the capital of the United States with several balloon stations up and down the Potomac River, they decided to do the same thing when they get to Richmond. Up on the blue part, that's called Mechanicsville. I don't know if anybody's been at Mechanicsville before, but that's where I live. Down the road where the red circle is, that's where Powhite Estate is located. We'll talk about that in great length. And then the green circle is Trent House. In fact, you guys were there today, right? Just walking around? Yeah, it's kind of cool. Now, Mechanicsville, Virginia consisted of not one, not two, but 5 wooden houses. It's not a big place back then. It's up on a little bit of a knoll. At the bottom of the knoll, there's the only windmill probably in all of Virginia located. If you talk about the windmill in Virginia, most people know where it is. So right up the hill is where they did this ballooning. And it was actually on the other side of these wooden structures about a quarter of a mile away. On the left-hand side, if you decide to take a trip there, there's a 7-Eleven right there so you can get gas, a Coke, and then walk around, okay? Now, this is Dr. William Gaines's estate. This is where they initially come and set up with 10,000 soldiers, and they set up the balloon station. A couple of really good stories is if you're driving up 295, look for mile marker number 33. If you go from Hampton, Virginia to Fredericksburg, there's only one open place in the entire tree line that surrounds 6495 or 295, and that's where all the ballooning was done. It's just, Tom, exactly where you said you were standing. But if you find mile marker 33 northbound on 295, that's where this is all being done. You're standing in hollow ground. It's really cool. Now, I circled, see that little red circle there? There's a little rancher that you can see there, and you can squint and you can see it. It's a brick rancher. Do you know where the brick came from? The 4 great chimneys that were a part of the original home that was there. The home existed till 1934. It was taken down. They salvaged the brick and turned it into this rancher. So this is hollow ground for all of us who are in the balloon business. Okay, ladies, this is important. William and Jane Gaines, he was about 58 and she was 49. Please wear colored clothes when you're getting your photograph taken, and don't wear doilies, okay? All the pictures that you ever see of women from that time period, always black dresses and doilies. Don't do it. It's not fashionable, because she was a very attractive woman. Now, I bring them up because, again, they had some direct contact with Lowe and all the Union forces there, and I won't go into some really funny stories and good stories. But Fanny Gaines was the daughter of the Gaines, and she kept a diary. And the one that I would like to share with you is the bottom one. To me, kind of sets the tone for what happens during this campaign. The yellow circle is where they are located. That's Dr. Gaines's estate. And the red one is a place called Cold Harbor. There's New Cold Harbor and Old Cold Harbor. And they did some ballooning up there too. And this is and you got to understand, here's this old Southern lady talking to Lowe. There was an old lady, Mrs. Woody, who lived 3 or 4 miles from us, and a balloon was sent up from her house too. When they were telling her what they had seen, she replied, "Yes, Moses also viewed the promised land, but he never entered." Same thing happens to Lowe, same thing happens to McClellan. The other balloon station was at Trent House. Trent House was where General McClellan had his headquarters until the night of, actually at 2 o'clock in the morning, when he decides that we've had enough and we're going to leave the battlefield and save the army for another day. But Trent House still exists today. There's only one minor change. And it's not even worth talking to you about, but they did the ballooning right outside the back door. The road that you see going by on the left-hand picture, actually in the original back then, actually went in front of the house, was 90 degrees to it, and we're about looking from where McClellan's headquarters would be. So McClellan always had a balloon close to his headquarters. Now, we've already talked a little bit about this. I wasn't sure what we were going to talk about, but again, he had the typical ground team, anywhere from 20 to 30 men. Like you mentioned, his father was the one who helped maintain the balloons, taught everyone how to operate them. That was one of the big secrets why he was very successful. And they used 3- and 4-man teams, 6, 7, 8 people, depending upon which balloon they were using. Always tethered as balloons, tried to use 3, sometimes 4 balloons. And once they got up, they're hand raised and hand brought down. One of the interesting things is if you look at the basket, as was always mentioned, always bright blue and white, or red, white, and blue with stars on it. You know, if you're going to get shot at, you might as well not get shot at by your own forces. Also, if you look at his hat, he always put the hat down. They didn't have sunscreen back then, and you get up 500, 1,000 feet above the ground, the sun's real bright, and so that's why he always had his hat turned down when he flew. Again, we've seen this picture before, but this is where he inflated his balloons. We've talked about the details. This is one of the famous pictures, lithos that was drawn during the Battle of Fair Oaks, right around the end of May, early June. It's hard to believe that the photographer, the draftsman, would stop everybody, line them up perfectly, but this is, again, an artist's rendition of the battle, but you can see the balloon that was overlooking the war. Many times he would bring the balloon back down, transcribe his notes to the telegraph operator. I'll point all that out here. There's Low over there. Here's the telegraph operator, tie in directly to the temporary telegraph lines and make his reports directly to the commanding general's staff. Here's one of those famous pictures that many of you have seen before. The long story very short, he happened to be in Mechanicsville and things were going real bad. He could tell from the air things were going very bad for the Union forces. So he telegraphs ahead, get the Intrepid up because I'm going to have to remove myself from Mechanicsville, gets on his horse, rides the 6 miles. When he gets there, the Intrepid's only half full, not light enough to lift anything. The Constitution still had gas in it, but it was deflated too. So what do? It takes, 3.5 hours to inflate these things from scratch, and time is the essence to them. So he has this idea. He takes a pot and pan, cuts the hole out of one of these things, ties both balloons together, and if you look really carefully, how many go camping? Air mattresses, time to go. How do you get the air out of them? Get on it, squish them. If you look carefully, you can see all kinds of men around there just squeezing as hard as they can, and he's able to push all the gas out of the Constitution and get it into the Intrepid, get himself up, and he was able to provide very valuable tactical information to McClellan and win the day. Here was a typical map that he would use. By then, he had produced some local area maps, and he would just draw pictures of where friendly and Confederate forces were. He would make notes on the bottom, get it down to his runners, and take it over to the general staff. Here they are, again, another one of the great pictures. You can see him seated next to his telegraph operator, and everyone holding the balloon down. Evening of the 27th, morning of the 28th, things were not going well for McClellan. He had already received communications from the President of the United States saying it's time to move and get your forces out of there. So this turns into what we know as the 7 days battle, where he brings his forces down to the James River so that they can be removed safely. So that pretty much ends his involvement in the Balloon Corps in a big strategic way. And it was really credit to him, the ability to generate gas, generate the reports, communicate, and provide valuable information to McClellan. Tom, I know we're short on time. Do you want me to skip ahead to the Confederates really quickly? Okay. Some cool pictures, but we won't get it. Okay, Confederates did have an Air Force. There were some reports in the very beginning of the war in 1861 that there was some Confederate ballooning activity up in Northern Virginia. It was never substantiated. We don't know who it is, what it was, so we don't like to talk about that too much. But as the Peninsula campaign was unfolding and McClellan was engaged with Magruder at Yorktown, Warwick, the rebel forces brought with them a single, what they call a large cotton bag. We would call it a hot air balloon today. This is the only hot air balloon that was used during the Civil War. Everything else used hydrogen or coal or city gas. Now, a young captain named John Bryant was asked if he would ride in this balloon. And of course, when a general asks you to do something, what do you do? Yes, sir. So he hops in this thing, and they used pine knots and pine cones because it burns real hot, and got this thing lit up and got it up into the air. Now, it had a single tether, and as was mentioned earlier, there's a problem with a single tether because as you're trying to observe, it's constantly doing this, and if you've never flown before, after a while, what happens? You don't feel too good. So anyway, and the good news is these hot air balloons were up for literally just minutes. They didn't stay up for hours like Lowe was able to. But he was able to provide, in a couple of flights that he made in this thing, some very, very valuable information, Magruder, about what McClellan was doing. If you've ever been to Lee Hall Mansion, just to the north of Fort Eustis, thank you. As you come off 64 and take the road, look to your right, that's the Lee Hall Mansion. Between you and Lee Hall Mansion is where they did this particular balloon flight. A couple of days later, out on the main battlefield near Red Battery, they describe it as Wynn's Mill. They did not do it in Wynn's Mill because that would have been an hour of your time in no man's land. You would have been shot and killed real easy. But a couple of days later, they again went up and got some more valuable information. It wasn't until about 3 weeks later that they made their third flight, and this is the one that really provided Magruder the information needed that it was time to go. He knew exactly what McClellan had set up. He knew if he waited any longer, he was going to start losing forces, and he did not want to do this. He had done his job. He had delayed McClellan, which gave Johnson and the other generals time up in Richmond to bring in more troops and fortify their defenses. Now, probably one of the most famous balloons next to the Intrepid is called the Silk Dress Balloon. Its real name was the Gazelle, and it's always been described as a colorful patchwork balloon using silk from the women's dresses. And that wasn't really true. And that came from this guy on the right-hand side, General Longstreet. If you're a general, your stories get longer and bolder and kind of more exaggerated the older you get. So 20 years after the war, he was really telling some great stories. But it's still one that we kind of talk about today. The Silk Dress Balloon, as it became known, was actually built in Savannah, Georgia, at a place called the Cheatham Armory by a Captain Langdon Sheave, and he built it at his own expense. South didn't have very much money. This is again where history crosses. Does the name Cheatham Armory mean anything to anybody? Does the 8th Air Force mean anything to anybody? Yeah, guess where it started? Same building a few years later, obviously. Now, this was a much smaller balloon than we've talked about earlier, only about 7,500 cubic feet. And again, it was made out of strips of silk that were brought in from Europe and had varnish on it. And I'm not even going to go through what gutta percha, Carr Spring dissolved in naphtha means, but it's a type of varnish that was used. And after it was built, not even test flown, brought up to Richmond, Virginia on June 24th, just in time for the engagements that were going on between the North and South forces. The pilot was a Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Porter Alexander, who becomes a general later on. He was on the staff, Lee's staff at the time, very familiar with artillery, topography, and all this stuff, so he was a natural choice. Now, I was a fighter pilot in the Air Force, and I spent a year getting my wings, another year learning how to fly the F-15, and about another 6 months getting all topped off before I'd go into combat. He had one flight. No ground school, didn't even know the principles of buoyancy. So on June 25th, he flies his first operational flight. Little chemistry, because I'm associated with the Science Museum of Virginia. Coal gas or city gas is nothing more than coal ground up, put into a vessel, heated up, and the off gas that comes out is methane. You and I produce that, cows produce that, and hydrogen gas. So that when you hear the term city gas, it's really cold, it's ground up, heated up, and that's where we get our gas from. So we were fortunate because here in Richmond, we had our own production of city gas. Now, quick 101 history on the 7 Days Battle. It's the strategic retreat that McClellan designed to get his forces from the battlefield to the James River so he could be covered by the Navy, which had very big guns, much bigger than the Army, and then get his army out of there. Now, again, the way they worked this was they would fill up their balloon at the Upper Gas Works, which was right next to the James River, and then bring it down to the York River Railroad Station, tether it to the back of a regular steam engine, and then take it out on the York River Railroad to see what they needed to see. And they used this for a couple of days. As the battle turns from the top of the screen down past them towards the James River, they needed to do something else. You know, we have 1,000 pictures of Lowe's balloons, drawings of all that. We have nothing of the silk dress balloon, although we do have material, which is this is the only drawing that I'm aware of. Maybe someone else down here can tell me otherwise. This is the only drawing we have of the silk dress balloon. If you squint real hard, you can see what looks like a drop of coffee. That's the only thing we have, drawn by this young man right here. Now, on June 27th is an important historical date for all of us because this is the first day in human history opposing air forces actually faced each other in combat. All right. When the battle turns and heads towards the river, we've got a problem for the South because they can't get their balloon where they need to. So they quickly said, well, we can put it on a steam locomotive, we can put it on a boat too. So they took it off the steam locomotive, it loaded onto the CSS Teaser, and then would take it down the James River to a place called Turkey Bend or Turkey Island. And there they could go up and again provide information to Lee, who was in rapidly following on the heels of McClellan as he retreated. Now, below the city of Richmond, the James River is a tidal river. And unfortunately, one time when they went down, there we go, ran aground. Got to wait till the tide comes up, and guess who comes around the corner? What's not pictured here is the USS Monitor and this USS Maritanza, which had a lower draft, so it could go up there. Fired a couple of rounds, the crew abandoned ship, and here we got these wonderful pictures of the damaged boiler and a 12-pound Parrott gun, which we have hundreds of. There on the back of the deck is the darn balloon, and guess what? They didn't take one picture of that. I tell you. All right, we do have pieces of fabric. Tom, do you have some here? Not tonight here, but you have some in the museum? Yeah, at the Hawsey Center, and I know at the Museum of the Confederacy, this is where I got my picture of it. This is my last slide, so Tom, I know you'll be happy. He's worried about time, and he should be. They, South produced another Gazelle-type balloon down in the Savannah-Charleston area. They operated it for about 6 or 8 months, but again, the quote was, it was carried away by high winds. Today we'd call that a hurricane. They didn't know all those terms back then. And if you look at the Confederates' efforts, they will tell you their commanding generals really felt that Lowe provided them with a lot of problems because they had to hide everything, double back. It was a huge problem for them for facing the Union balloons. And they were absolutely surprised that the Union stopped using them. They loved them, they wanted to use them, but they didn't have the money and they didn't have the means to charge these things out in the fuel. So those two items, money and a lack of portability of gas, was their downfall. Tom?
Thanks, Mike. Our last speaker is Tom Hill. Tom's a retired naval officer who spent a good deal of time researching in naval records. And I guess it was last year, he wrote 2 really wonderful articles on the Navy and Civil War ballooning for the Journal of the American Aviation Historical Society. So he's here tonight to tell us about that aspect of things. Tom?
Yeah, okay. Okay. Ready to go? Good evening. Before I start talking about the naval aeronautics in the Civil War, I'd like to make a short aside, just to note that naval-related operations of observation balloons, although they took a very small percentage of the total number of flights during the war, they can be documented on some 24 occasions and over a surprisingly wide variety, a number of military campaigns and theaters. Now, I have to say, the U.S. Navy did not operate observation balloons, but on at least 2 occasions, they requested assistance from the Balloon Corps. Also, probably of more importance is that, as has been discussed, the Navy constructed Lowe's gas generators down at the Washington Navy Yard, and also they constructed the first vessel specifically designed to support aeronautics at sea. Now, Lowe was not the first person to fly a balloon from a ship, although he claimed that distinction for himself, among other things. It was, as noted, his fiercest critic, John LaMountain. Now, LaMountain was reported to have been a merchant seaman before he took up ballooning. And in May of 1861, when he offered his services to Major General Benjamin Butler at Fortress Monroe, he was a fairly well-known balloonist. Now, Butler, actually I should say, Fort Monroe stayed in Union hands when Virginia seceded from the Union. But by May of 1861, Butler found himself confronted by Confederate forces on 3 sides. His only line of communication open to the east through the Chesapeake Bay, and Butler clearly needed help at this time. Now, LaMountain appeared at Fortress Monroe in the latter part of July and made a number of flights, observation flights from the fort. One of the bigger gifts to Butler was he discovered that the reports of 8,000 Confederate troops massing towards Yorktown were not true, but LaMountain did notice that the Confederates were building artillery batteries on the far side of Hampton Roads at Pig Point, Craney Island, and particularly at Sewell's Point above Norfolk, which today is the site of the Norfolk Naval Station. At some point, LaMountain probably decided he needed to get a closer look at these batteries. And I think it was the merchant seaman in him and decided on the 3rd of August he was going to take his balloon to sea. He loaded upon the steamer Fanny and then motored out into Hampton Roads. He did make a stop, made an ascension off Sewell's Point, and discovered that the encampments there were actually much greater or larger than had observed from Fort Monroe, and also more importantly that a couple of large caliber artillery pieces were being in place there, and they were sighted on Fortress Monroe and the Union anchorage at Point Comfort. Following that, he went up to Pig Point and Craney Island, but really didn't see much, returned to the fort. For the next week, bad weather kept him grounded, but on the 10th of August, he was again able to fly twice during the day. He made 1 flight during the day from the fort. The second flight, a night flight, was made from Hampton Roads once again, only this time on the steamer Adriatic. Now, as had been mentioned, night flights provide an entirely different perspective of the battlefield, and lanterns, campfires, other things would point out locations of Confederate troops that weren't observable during the day. So he returned to the fort, made a report to General Butler. Included in the report was a sketch of Sewell's Point, the defenses there. Now, unfortunately, these were the last 2 flights that LaMountain could make at the fort. He had run out of gas and also gas supplies, but Butler was very happy with the work. So he made an agreement with LaMountain to have the aeronaut go back to New York, build a new balloon, and return. Unfortunately, in September, when LaMountain returned to Fortress Monroe, Butler was gone. He'd been reassigned, and the new commanding general, John Wool, knew nothing about this agreement and sent LaMountain back to the Washington area, where balloonists were in great demand at the time. So as has been discussed, this was Thaddeus Lowe's territory. he and LaMountain did not get along. They agreed to cooperate, but that agreement soon went by the boards, and they were bickering and arguing with each other. Politically, Low had the upper hand. He was a chief balloonist, and when he deployed to the peninsula in March of 1862, LaMountain, as was noted, was left behind and left the service shortly thereafter. Now, the previous speakers have talked a lot about Low's genius, and I have to agree with them. But I think one of the really things that gets, or from my perspective, is not only his vision, but he had a practical plan to implement that vision. He understood that if he was going to support the Army, he had to operate his balloons in the field. To do that, he had to have an independent source of gas generation. And as has been noted, he invented an effective gas generator that could be put on the back of a wagon. Now, Low's problem was he had to do this economically, but he knew that the only place really in Washington that could really build these things, that had the metalsmiths and the carpenters to do that, was the Washington Navy Yard. So Low arranged to get a letter of introduction to Commander John Dahlgren, the yard's commandant, who immediately agreed to assist Low in the project and turned the construction job over to Henry Forrest, the yard's chief constructor. Now, I have to mention that even before LaMountain made his first flight in Hampton Roads, Low had a concept of being able to put his new generators on a barge and also with his balloons work on the water. And he had kind of envisioned this as putting a couple of barges together, putting a flat deck on it, putting the generator and a balloon on it, and you could be towed behind a ship to areas that would need him. In November, early November, in a meeting with Dahlgren at the Navy Yard, he broached the concept, and Dahlgren again was very amenable to doing this for Low. He in fact volunteered the hull of an old steamer called the George Washington Parke Custis. The Custis had been built in 1852 as a steamer to work the Potomac between Mount Vernon and Georgetown, and for some reason in 1856 the steam engine was removed and it was turned into a barge. The Army or the Navy bought it 5 years later for $150 and for use as a coal barge at the Washington Navy Yard. Once again, Dahlgren turned the job over to Henry Forrest, who constructed a deck on the hull of the Custis. Now, according to reports, the deck hung over the side probably by 3 to 4 feet, but the total gave Low some 22 to 24 feet of deck width and maybe 80 feet upon which to handle a balloon on the ship. Quite enough room to do that. And I should also mention that there are no known pictures or drawings, plans of the Custis. So all the kind of the pictures and drawings you see here tonight are all notional. Now, also should mention that Henry Forrest built this deck in just 3 days and was ready to go on the 10th of November, which was good because the new balloons that Low had commissioned were coming online, and McClellan wanted him to provide the first of the balloons to General Joseph Hooker, whose division held the Maryland shore of the Potomac south of Washington. As was mentioned, Union forces held Alexandria and parts of northern Virginia, but Confederates took the rest of the Virginia shore of the Potomac below the Occoquan and had been building artillery batteries at Freestone, Cockpit, and Shipping Points, the objective being to blockade the Potomac and stop Union shipping going to and from Washington. Obviously, McClellan was very interested in what was happening on the other side of the river. So on the 10th of November, Low put the Constitution aboard the Custis, was towed down to Indian Head, Montauwoman Creek, and over the next 3 days made maybe 8 to 10, possibly more ascensions off the deck of the Custis. They were day and night flights, and he took several senior officers up in the balloons to observe what was going on in Virginia. And now after 3 days, General Hooker asked that the Constitution be put ashore at Budd's Ferry, which it was, and these were the last of the flights that were known to have occurred from the deck of the Custis on the Potomac. However, the barge remained in heavy demand, moving supplies between Budd's Ferry, the Washington Navy Yard, Alexandria, Georgetown, other points in Northern Virginia where Lowe's balloons were being operated. Now, after this, additional balloons became available to Lowe, and McClellan asked that he send at least 2 of them to other theaters. The first of these was to go down to South Carolina to assist in the blockade of Charleston and the port of Savannah. In November, Lowe chose one of his assistant aeronauts, John Starkweather, and the balloon Washington to go down south. Starkweather appeared in Hilton Head in early January of 1862, and the commanding general, Thomas Sherman, took an interest in the balloon, asked him to fly it, and unfortunately, Starkweather spent 3 days in heavy gales, heavy winds, could not make any real observations, had to deflate the balloon, and Sherman essentially lost interest in the project, and Starkweather cooled his heels for another 3 months or so. Now, in early April, a new general, Henry Benham, came along, reinvigorated the Union offensive, seized Fort Pulaski at the mouth of the Savannah River, essentially closing the port of Savannah. But he was still interested in what was going on in the city. So at the end of April, he called on Starkweather and asked him to move the balloon down to Fort Pulaski and to make observations of Savannah. Now, it was noted at the time the most effective way to do this would be to put the balloon on the deck of a ship, run it up the Savannah River, which Starkweather did using the steamer Mayflower. Starkweather also wrote to Lowe saying that for the most part of the month of May, the weather was good, the balloon remained inflated, and it could fly almost every day. Now, if this is the case, in this particular instance, probably more ascensions were made from the deck of a ship than any time during the Civil War. However, we don't have any statistics to back up this claim, so I can't go any further, but it's probably one area where they really used the balloon on the ship. Now, at the end of May, early June, Union plans changed. They wanted to do pretty much the same thing to close the port of Charleston. The plan was to take Union troops up to the Stono River, go overland across James Island, and seize Fort Johnson at the mouth of Charleston Harbor, which would effectively close the harbor to Confederate shipping. Starkweather moved the balloon Washington on the Mayflower up to Stono River, and we know for a fact that he flew at least on the 7th of June. There are reports that the balloon observations that caused the Union forces to make adjustments in their lines. Now, either later that day or shortly thereafter, the Mayflower was blown ashore in a gale. The Washington was battered against the superstructure of the ship. The envelope ruptured, and having neither the means to make more gas or repair the envelope, Starkweather retired to New York and essentially left Lowe's service. Now, the second balloon to be used out of area was to go off to the Missouri Department to assist in Union efforts to seize the upper Mississippi River. In February of 1862, Lowe chose John Steiner and the balloon Eagle to go out to Cairo, Illinois, to take on this mission. Now, Starkweather arrived in Hilton Head and really met indifference from the Army. When Steiner, however, appeared in Cairo, he met with outright hostility. The Army didn't want him, they hadn't asked for him, they refused to provide him supplies or pay, and basically ignored him. So after wandering around the streets of Cairo for several weeks, Steiner was introduced to Flag Officer Andrew Foote, who commanded the Union naval forces on the northern part of the Mississippi, and Foote said, yeah, he could use Steiner's services. Now, the plan at the time, the Union plan, was to run down the Mississippi. Their first obstacle was island number 10, which was a heavily fortified Confederate fort in the middle of the Mississippi at the Tennessee-Kentucky border, and also had shore batteries defending it. The Army plan was to go overland through Missouri, take the town of New Madrid, and then make an amphibious land crossing of the river below the fort, and then come up from the south and behind to seize the fort. Now, Foote's problem was pretty obvious. The Army needed Navy support to get across the river due to gunboats and Confederate artillery batteries. Foote's problem was obvious, that island number 10 lay between his flotilla and New Madrid. But he had a plan. So he had gunboats that he brought down. And the gunboats were able to, or would be able to basically take under fire the shore batteries, but they couldn't bear on the island itself. To handle this issue, Foote had a mortar division, which were flat barges that each carried a 13-inch siege mortar. And the issue there would be the mortars would fire over the bend in the river, over the headland to the fort directly. Their problem was because of the headland, they couldn't see the fort, and so they couldn't see the fall of the shot. So in this case, the use of an observation balloon was obvious. So by latter part of March, Steiner put the Eagle and the gas generators on a barge, went down to the flotilla off island number 10. He flew once on the 24th of March, probably to test the atmosphere, and then the next day flew several times, at least made several ascensions, one of which he took the commanding officer of the mortar division up in a balloon to observe the fall of shot. The logbook for the division said basically that the visibility was poor, it was hazy. It was noted that they could see the fall of the shot, and it said only that the experiment was a success. Several days later, Foote telegraphed the Navy Department to say the mortars had caused great damage to the island, and newspaper accounts indicated that maybe 20 or 30 Confederate soldiers had been killed. Unfortunately, there was nothing that actually linked Steiner's observations to the damage that was done. So it's all a surmise, but obviously it helped. This is an important issue, at least a milestone kind of for naval aeronautics, in that this was the first time the US Navy actually used aerial observation to support naval gunfire. Now, enough damage apparently was done to the fort that several days later, Foote could get his, a couple of his ships downriver. They made the crossing, the fort fell to Union forces on the 7th of April. These were the only known ascensions that Steiner could make, or did make, in the West. He apparently ran out of gas. The Army refused to provide supplies to him, and after about 4 months, he finally gave up, and in July, rejoined Low for the latter days of the Peninsula Campaign. Now, Mike has pretty much gone over a lot of what happened on the peninsula. But what I'm really going to talk about really is the naval aspects. And in this case, it was really the Custis came into its own as a naval support, aeronautical support vessel. Low, in the March of 1862, when Low moved balloons down to the peninsula, 2 of the 3 balloons traveled on the Custis. After they were offloaded, or at least one of the 2 offloaded, the Custis was brought up to Cheeseman Creek, up the middle of the peninsula, and acted primarily as an aeronautical supply and intermediate depot. Ships would bring acid, iron filings up there. They'd store it aboard the barge until the supplies could be moved out to the balloons operating off Yorktown. When the Confederates abandoned Yorktown in early May, Low moved the balloons back onto the Custis, and the Custis proceeded up the York River at this time to support General Franklin's amphibious assault at West Point. And Low writes that at that time he'd made several ascensions from the Custis to provide observations for Franklin. Now, it's been pointed out, from West Point, the Army moved west, and the main supply depot moved from West Point to White House. And Low writes in his memoirs that as Custis was being towed up the Pamunkey, he made a number of ascensions from the moving a deck of the vessel to see the disposition of Confederate forces at that point. As Mike pointed out, the main operations on the peninsula moved to Richmond until late in June. The reverses, McClellan had some reverses in Mechanicsville, and White House was hastily abandoned as a supply depot. The Custis again was towed down New York, back up the James River to meet McClellan's forces moving back down to Harrison's Landing. Now again, this is where the Custis really came into its own. One, it was the sole point for inflation of the balloons. Mike didn't mention it, but in the retreat, the balloons that were or the gas generators that were on the wagons were left in the field and captured. They managed to bring the balloons back to Harrison's Landing, but no generators. So Custis was the sole source for gas. It continued to be a supply point, and also it also had the tools, the material, and the supplies needed to redo the cordage and some of the netting on the balloons after 3 hard months of service. So it was useful there. But probably most importantly, from a naval aspect, the Custis was involved in a naval reconnaissance where a balloon flying from its deck joined a surface reconnaissance group to go after Fort Powhatan, which is about 10 miles downriver from Harrison's Landing. Now, in late July, Commodore Charles Wilkes, the naval commander on the James, had been getting a lot of reports of Confederate snipers and light artillery fire coming from the vicinity of Fort Powhatan, which had been abandoned, and he was determined to put an end to it. So on the 30th of July, he asked the Balloon Corps for help. James Allen and Steiner put the Intrepid aboard the Custis, and it joined a 3-gunboat flotilla going down the James to Fort Powhatan, where Allen wrote that he made 2 ascensions and then a 3rd ascension that morning about 8 miles farther down the river. They didn't see anything. They saw no Confederate forces, but apparently Commodore Wilkes was quite pleased with the activity, called them back early, and the newspapers recorded essentially the expedition had been a success. Again, from a naval aeronautics standpoint, this is interesting because this was really the first use, or pardon me, it's the first time a balloon was used in conjunction with the Naval Surface Group to meet a common operational goal. And it was kind of crude, but it was the first time an air element was integrated with the sea element together. And so it's kind of a naval aeronautics milestone. Now, Custis returned to Harrison's Landing. About 2 weeks later, it was ordered back to Washington in the middle of August when McClellan left the peninsula. Now, Custis wound up at the Washington Navy Yard. It did have a short career after that, in that it did join and support the Fredericksburg campaign in the latter part of 1862 into the spring of 1863. It was known that the Custis did move personnel and supplies between Washington and the various ports on the Potomac that supported Union forces in Fredericksburg. On the 17th of April in 1863, Lowe ordered that the few unserviceable balloons still around Fredericksburg, plus some of the unserviceable gas generators, be loaded aboard the Custis, and have it returned to the Washington Navy Yard with the gas generators given back and the Custis returned to the possession of Henry Forrest. At this point, the Custis disappears from naval records, and unfortunately, its ultimate disposition is unknown. And that's pretty much the story of naval aeronautics in the Civil War. So, thank you.
Well, you've heard a lot about ballooning in the Civil War. The impact, in spite of the fact that the Corps was going out of business in 1863, was extraordinary, more in Europe than in America. But the truth is that ballooning in the Civil War actually began sort of a resurgence of ballooning with the European armies, France, England, and Germany. And in the rest of the 19th century, balloons are used pretty constantly during the Franco-Prussian War and colonial wars, the Boer War, and so on and so forth, right up to the turn of the 20th century. Why don't we bring everybody back up? It's 9 o'clock, but we have time, I think, for a question or two. We'll let the gentleman take seats here. So, yes, sir. Yes.
Hi, how are you? I was just curious that you made no mention of, you're using a hydrogen gas, a very flammable gas, yet there was never any mention of any, Hindenburg-type explosion, fires, or anything like that. Was he just extra careful, or how did Mr. Lowe manage to avoid that?
Well, when Jim was describing the inflation wagons, he talked about the heat and the pressure that these things generated. I've always thought that for the crews operating around the inflation wagons, it must have been an interesting experience. Any of the rest of you have anything to say about, Kevin Knapp?
Can I share? As a balloon pilot, most people, when you mention hydrogen, automatically, at least here in the United States, think about the Hindenburg. In the Hindenburg explosion, it was coming in during a lightning storm. It was more the coating or the paint on the outside skin of the aircraft to help reflect or give radiant heat or lift during its flight. And that static spark is what made the explosion. In a hydrogen explosion, the hydrogen goes poof, and it's up and it's done. The flame that occurred during the Hindenburg, what we all remember, was more from the paint, etc. In Europe, we use hydrogen all the time because more often here in the United States.
Less expensive.
Well, actually, in Europe, they use hydrogen. The balloon ports are built next to chemical plants. The chemical process, the byproduct of chemical process, is hydrogen. They don't have access to helium because it's mostly here in the United States.
And expensive.
And very expensive to import. So for trained balloonists, hydrogen is a very safe gas, and we use it all the time today. It is less expensive for me to fly to Germany, stay for 2 weeks, make 7 to 10 ascensions than it is to fly one helium flight here in the United States. To fill a 1,000 cubic meter balloon with helium today costs $10,000 to $12,000.
Right. Yes, sir.
Two-part question. In the beginning, you have Lowe ascending and then using a telegraph to communicate with the ground. Did any of these other campaigns use the telegraph? Yes. That's the first question. The second question, just to save time, is there any evidence whatsoever that anyone attempted photography from balloons during the Civil War?
Who wants to tackle the telegraph? Jim? Or Mike?
Let Mike talk about telegraph, and I can talk about.
During the Peninsula Campaign, Lowe used both the telegraph on occasion. He also, a lot of times, would come down, transcribe using the telegraph that way. Other times, just prepare his written report with maps and then get back in and go up. So he used all three methods there.
In terms of photography, that's sort of one of my holy grails would be to find a photograph taken from one of Lowe's balloons. Now, it turns out we have some anecdotal evidence, and that is in the Peninsula Campaign, Lowe catches malaria, gets malaria, and goes back. And Allen runs the balloon corps for about a month, and then it returns to Washington. And in that list of supplies is photographic equipment. When Allen had the balloon and was returning back to Washington, D.C. Now, here's the reason why that's so exciting, and that is in, I guess it was 1858 or so,
Right.
just a year or so
Right.
before the Civil War, Allen and King in Boston, launching a balloon off Boston Commons, took the first picture from a balloon of Boston. 1860. All right, it was just before the Civil War. So Allen knew how that whole process went. He'd been part of the first picture, and the fact that there was photographic equipment that came back just tantalizes me, and that Allen may have taken some pictures from the balloon, but we have no record of it.
Well, the French had done it too. The French had taken at least one photograph from the air from a balloon before our Civil War. And of course, after the war in Europe, photographers like Félix Ternechon, Nadar in Paris combined photography and ballooning. So as Jim says, it's something that's always tantalized all of us. But to this point, there's no evidence there's no photograph anyway. Yes?
Two questions, sir. Number one, was there any evidence that somebody tried to do real-time information from the balloons with flags as they were used to doing from ships, et cetera? And secondly, was there any attempt at all in history to do anything offensive with like snipers or other activity from the balloon?
The first question is, well, Jim?
The first question dealt with, they're called wigwag signals.
Right.
You know, flags. Okay. They did work out some procedures before the Peninsula Campaign when Lowe was basically educating himself and the rest of the Army on how to use balloons. Up at Chain Bridge, they had some cannons that were shooting at targets that they couldn't see. For those who've never shot a gun before, a tube is what the Army calls it. You shoot it, where did it hit? A little left, so we move the gun a little bit to the right, a little too close, a little too far. You make some visual adjustments. And what they were working on was the process by which they could use the balloon to actually have cannons shoot targets that they couldn't see. They used the first part of the test was all telegraph. Hey, you're short, you're long, left, right. Then the next one, he worked out a set of signals using the semaphores, the wigwag, I should say, and worked out those. I'm not aware of any time, like on the Peninsula Campaign or any of the other campaigns where they actually used it in practice. I don't know, does anybody else?
I can comment on that. In January 1863, the last several months before the Balloon Corps ended, Lowe came up with a system of flags that he wanted to use, and he presented it to Hooker, and Hooker said, no way, we're not going to do that. Now that is really unfortunate, and the reason why is if you remember when I was talking about the Peninsula Campaign, most of Hooker's army was way west and the balloons were way east. And so anything that Lowe had to see, he had to send a message down to the ground, which a courier brought. You could see the balloons, and all they needed was a flag to say, hey, you're just going to be run over, you know. And so it was unfortunate, but Hooker said no, and he sure could have used them.
We have in the NASA archive one of the original illustration boards that Lowe did for that late signal system that came late in the history of the Corps.
There's a photo of that flags also with Clovis Lowe, and that is
There is, you're right. Michael Patras reminds us that there is a photograph of Lowe and his father with the flags. Yes.
we have a two-part question.
What about the sniper one?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, that's right. I didn't understand.
There was no snipers from the balloons. No one shot from balloons.
Oh, that was okay.
Yeah, right. And so they were much further and out of range. You know, the artillery shells couldn't even reach them. There was some anecdotal information, or there was some buzz in the press about using balloons to drop
Right.
bombs, but that never happened either.
You have to understand the weapons of the time. At the beginning of the Civil War, everything was smooth bore. Average killing range, 60, 80 yards. It wasn't until halfway through that we went to rifle. Now you have a killing range of 600 yards out to 1,000 yards. So if you're 2-3 miles behind the enemy's line, you know, you can shoot even though that bullet's going downhill. It has God's G helping to get there. It still doesn't have an oomph and enough guidance to do anything. So it was, you know, like flooding a spice water at them out there. You're not going to do any good.
Now,
Is there any record of
I'll do the Count von Zeppelin part. The question had to do with Count von Zeppelin's connection to the balloons. He didn't have any connection during the war itself. Von Zeppelin was here as a representative of the army of Württemberg with no wars going on in Europe since the Napoleonic Wars. They sent young officers over here to gain experience with the Union of the Confederate Armies. And Count von Zeppelin came, operated with the Federal Cavalry. In fact, he was almost captured at one point west of Fairfax Courthouse when his picket line was overrun by Confederate cavalry. When he had done his term with the Union Army, he decided he wanted to see some of the rest of the country. So he went to New York, up the Hudson, crossed the Erie Canal, crossed the Great Lakes, out into what was then the wilds of Minnesota. And he was somewhere in the neighborhood of St. Paul when he runs across, guess who? John Steiner, an aeronaut we've heard about tonight. Steiner was German, and in fact, he spoke broken English. And when you look at his dispatches, you can tell English is not this guy's first language. So here's this young German officer and this young German balloonist, and they meet, and they kind of bond. Zeppelin actually flew with Steiner, and Zeppelin remembered in later years, Steiner talked about his dream of a navigable balloon, and Zeppelin says he never forgot that. And 30 years later, he goes to work on it himself. What was the first half of the...
Balloon observations during the Potomac blockade. And, so, and Tom actually talked
ahead,
a little
Tom.
bit about that.
I'm sorry, the types of observations?
There was a record of them, and who made those ascensions?
At Bud's Ferry, plenty of
Bud's Ferry?
Yeah, at Bud's Ferry, there isn't a formal record. I know the newspapers carried accounts of various ascensions at the time, and sometimes it's hard to separate some of the various newspaper reports as to how many ascensions were made in each day. And they did make day and night, and they did take some Union officers, and I think Hooker's chief of staff went up to make observations. I don't think there was any that I'm aware of, any official accounting or record that puts them all together. You just have to go through the newspaper accounts, and they're very contradictory when you're looking at them.
It's interesting. The Army really didn't trust the balloonists themselves to make observations. So they normally flew with officers who had engineering, topographic experience, that kind of thing. We have Lowe's binoculars, one set of his binoculars, on exhibit in a case here looking at Earth. And they came to us from Leon Lowe, one of Lowe's descendants, and along with them came a list like this of federal officers who looked through those binoculars. And it starts with General McClellan and goes down to then Lieutenant George Armstrong Custer. So a lot of officers did fly with the balloons. One more?
Holy cow.
Holy cow, okay. Yeah, up there.
Was a balloon basket ever armored to get through the danger zone?
Was a balloon basket never armored to get through the danger zone?
I can.
Put plates in the bottom.
Yeah,
Yep.
Wise did. He put a metal plate down there. I don't know if Lowe did. I haven't seen any records that he did that, but they certainly weren't on the side. They were pretty much a wicker basket.
Yeah, there's some reports that after a while Lowe put some of those boilerplates, if you will, on the bottom of the balloons, just like Wise did early in
Okay.
in his flying.
Yes, sir.
Your presentation talked about the cost of some of this. Overall, in the effort, in expenses for the war, was this like a spare no expense thing that they thought it was so valuable, or how does it measure up to the cost?
Well, it certainly wasn't spare no expense. Jim, I guess.
Yeah, the question was
should've.
how expensive really was the balloon corps? Well, when you look at the amount of money they spent at the beginning of it, you had about maybe $8,000 to $10,000 worth of balloons and equipment, and that's about the salary of a colonel for a year. So in perspective, it's not an enormous amount of money, but the visibility that they're spending that kind of money was great. And so there was, so at beginning, Lowe really had his way. He could build anything. GW Park Custis, the gas generators, the balloons. He really got the infrastructure going. But later on, the Balloon Corps was looked at as being too expensive to run and operate, when in reality, it probably wasn't.
Yes.
What were the balloons made of?
Yeah, they were silk, varnish, low. Most balloonists in the 19th century had their own recipes for varnish. And in fact, Mike talked about part of the recipe for what they used in the Gazelle, in the Southern balloons. So, yeah.
India silk.
Yes. One more. Go ahead.
You mentioned that he did not have military rank, but it looked like in one of the articles that they referred to him as colonel.
The question is, they didn't have military rank, the aeronauts, but in one of the articles he'd seen, they were referred to as, I guess Lowe was referred to as colonel or something. Before the war, these guys were almost universally known as professor, or, you know, they were given some sort of an honorific title, these balloonists. And I don't know, Jim, were you going to?
Yeah, I think Lowe kind of promoted that a little bit. He certainly didn't correct the press. But he felt, of course, that is a distinction of, that is a signature of distinction, and that's indeed what he wanted to portray. It was part of his mystique, but none of the aeronauts were in the service.
And more than that, it was part of the basic problem. One of the real difficulties of the Balloon Corps, the Aeronautic Corps, was the difficulty they had integrating with military structure. And the fact that these guys were not officers, that they were contractors, I think represented a big part of the problem and an indication of the way in which the Army, at least in Washington, was looking at this experiment. Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. Oh, okay, one more. Go ahead. The question is there a website or a book you can go to for information on any of this? There are a number of good websites. The National Air and Space Museum website at the moment talks about some of this very early on. And Kevin's just passed this up. No, all I did was write the introduction.
$9.99 right here.
A wonderful scholar, if somewhat eccentric, someone I knew at the end of his life, Frederick Stansbury Hayden, wrote this book, which was originally called Aeronautics in the Union and Confederate Armies. When Hopkins asked me to do a new edition, they didn't take my advice. They retitled it as Military Ballooning During the Early Civil War. But after all these years, originally published in 1940, Frederick Hayden's military ballooning, which you can find all over the place, is good. And you want to give me, yeah, here we go. Charles Evans, War of the Aeronauts, A History of Ballooning in the Civil War, is not a bad book. Ultimately, I think there'll be one that's a little fuller and more complete than this, but now it's a good one. And give me Gail's book. If you have any young people out there who are interested, Gail Yarrow, a friend, wrote this one, Lincoln's Flying Spies, Civil War Balloon Corps. I don't think you'll find many errors in it. It's really a good book, great pictures. Gail was here last Saturday signing books, so I'll recommend that one as well.
Before Tom leaves, though, and he's too modest to say this, Tom has written an excellent balloon book as a major overview with several chapters on the Civil War, done exceptionally well. It's called Eagles Aloft.
And it's like 25 years old.
Yeah, but it's good.
So thanks to all of you on the panel tonight, and thanks to all of you for coming.